Hi, everybody. We are so excited to bring you today Dr. Carla Ionescu. Is that correct?
Ionescu, that works.
Ionescu. I am here with my good friend, Lady Snappy, and we are going to be talking with Dr. Carla about the trans community of antiquity and why it needs to be brought out and talked about much more today. So without further ado, Snappy, go ahead because I've already got to talk with Dr. Carla previous interview. So I know that Snappy has a lot of questions. So go ahead.
So I guess we should start off with I wanted to ask you about one of the things I've noticed just in my studies is that all across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, we seem to see lots of these gender fluid kind of religious communities or religious cults, if we're going to use like that kind of a term. People like the Scythian Inari, or you have the Gala or the Galloi, the Coriobantes, the Canaphori. There seem to be so many different versions of this. And also we see all of these depictions specifically of the goddess in this kind of gender fluidity. Because we know like Artemis is described as being as androgynous at times or masculine forward being. And also we see some of the earliest depictions of like the goddess Aphrodite having a penis. And even like Artemis at Ephesus, there's all this talk about her possibly having testicles on her chest and things like this. So I wanted to ask you, what is your kind of understanding of how gender even works in the ancient world? Are there specific like third gender categories, or is it more of something that's like a religious calling?
Ooh, that's a big question, Snappy. It's a great question. It's a great question. And so I can only say sort of the evidence that we have. And and you all know that it's very difficult to like categorize sexuality because they use different terminology, right? So they didn't have like a queer terminology, let's say, or even the term trans or any of those terms. So sometimes
Not even
people
homosexual, right?
not
In
even
Greek.
homosexual, not gay, not nothing. So any of the words that were not lesbian, even today you go to the island of Lesbos and you ask the citizens for lesbians and they will look at you like, who are you? What are you doing here? Um, in fact, they're quite opposed to that terminology. So they didn't have this terminology, which makes it very, very difficult for us to then read into text. And so, for example, just recently I had a comment on one of the gay gods of Greece that I was doing, and they're like, "What's your evidence for the gayness?" And so a lot of it is implied, especially in things like mourning, dress, like the way that they dressed, how they cried or mourned their loved ones. And I'm trying to think what are some other ways that like the intimacy. And so I think that the Greeks would have recognized the word friend in like all these different categories, for example, right? Like close friend, like Achilles and Patroclus, close friends, even Artemis and Callisto. There's some jealousy going on there. Zeus has to shift his body into Callisto to seduce her. I mean, there's an implication here, right? Um, but the challenge comes in the modern world comes from people who go, well, there's no clear evidence. As far as I think trans culture, I think gender fluidity is probably the safest word to use. I don't know. Because I don't think that I think that there was, like you say, groups of people that were understood to perform gender and highly accepted, right? But then there's stories like, for example, when Inanna literally physically changes gender, right? So that's that's in our definition a very trans, let's say, action, right? That's a physical change. And so the challenges I think come from those blurry lines where people are like, well, is it really the way we define it today or is it not? I don't think the ancients had a lot of problems with sexuality the way that we do today. I really, yeah, you know what I mean? I really don't. Aristotle, like he says it straight out, we have sex with men for pleasure and with women for procreation. I mean, he just says it like it's nothing. And everybody goes, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Does he identify as a gay man? Of course not. Right? Like that wouldn't have been
That's
right?
not really a thing, right?
No,
And
that wouldn't have been a thing.
it gets so interesting. Like it's amazing that you brought up Inanna, because I was reading earlier today about her priesthood,
Mhm.
and there would be all of this kind of gender spectrum amongst the priesthood. You'd see priests who were male who transitioned, for lack of a better term, to female, and then were priestesses. But then you also have women who are acting as temple guardians, who are then presenting as men. And then you have people who kind of present as one gender during a religious ceremony and then return to their assigned gender at birth
Yeah.
back in their normal life. So it seems like in summer especially they had such a wide spectrum of gender.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so this is why I think it becomes difficult when we apply modern expectations. And this is why sometimes when you say like gayness, let's say as an umbrella term for LGBTQ and plus, it's like the backlash is always, where is your evidence and da 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 da. And even when I talk about Inanna, like Inanna has very clear worship, which is why it makes it easier for us to use her as a great example. And we could maybe trace her even before the Greeks somewhat, a little bit. And so I was just thinking of Artemis of Ephesus too. Well, her priest, though, again, we don't have exactly evidence of how they presented, um, but that would not have been surprising, The interesting question is why. That would be really fascinating, like why the gender fluidity happened in worship like that. To me, that's a curiosity, right? Like, is it again, we're trying to put ourselves in the conscious minds of the ancient world, but is it a kind of completion to experience all genders in ritual?
I mean,
Uh,
that seems to be like where I see things, because we see that carry over even into the Christian era with the alchemical tradition and this idea of the rebus, the holy and androgyne. You see it in the Roman era with the cult of Attis and Cybele, and the Galli, who specifically go through this. They call it, like Julian the Emperor calls it, this divine imitation, where they're
that's right.
trying to embody the Great Mother and reject the nymphs. But so it's like this weird, but again, it's not really like gender as we would understand it. And
Yeah.
it's like this, it really reminds me also, like we see this a lot in my background is studying Indian traditions.
Hmm.
And when we look at, like in India, for example, you get a lot of these famous saints who would take on what they call a mood, and they would draw down aspects of these goddesses and become possessed by them. Like famously, you have Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who becomes Radha, who is the consort of Krishna. And there are descriptions of him like lusting after Krishna as a young girl. And this is supposed to be the highest form of love one can have. And you're
Hmm.
supposed to embody that feminine love. But they don't perform this gender all the time. It's like a possession state. And like Ramakrishna with Kali does the same thing. But then we also see groups like the Hijra, which are going through a full castration ritual and are
Yes.
dedicating themselves and are becoming a third sex that's recognized in that culture.
Yes.
So it's there seems to be such a wide spectrum of this
Would
stuff,
the
right?
would the question be better, not why it happened then, but why those traditions faded out, or
Hmm.
not completely out, but really went into the back of the room, if you know what I mean? Like, why was it just pushed and buried? Like, the information about it buried, especially in spirituality. Like, you have to dig pretty deep into paganism to say, whoa, this was everyday normal life then, right?
Yeah.
What made it fade out or away? I won't say out, it never went out, but lessened.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I remember reading in the Greek text is a series of persecution specifically against women's rights. Like you have the constant persecution of the Maenads. And I know Emperor Julian in his Hymn to the Mother of Gods connects this to the cult of Attis. And he talks about how it's also like this persecution of these, these non-binary or transitioning priests who are going through these castration rites. And he even thinks that this is what brought about the fall of the Greek Empire and will bring about the fall of Rome. So there's all this weirdness that goes in there, but it seems like a lot of this stuff has to do with the control of women as well, I think.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I was just thinking, I wonder if there's something, and again, this is all speculation, but I wonder if there's something in the feminine. Maybe I don't wonder, maybe I kind of feel like it is. There's something in the feminine that obviously scares the patriarchy in some way. And particularly men, biological men that perform femininity, right? Seem to really scare patriarchy or patriarchal men, let's say. I don't know, traditional men. And now I'm thinking about it, like, why is that? Like, what is it? And so even in, homophobia, for example, people say, oh, I don't have anything against gay people, but I don't like the men that are very like flowery or whatever the word is. And I'm always like, well, then you have something against gay men, and but I find it fascinating that as a biological male leans towards femininity, whether it's full on a transition or performance, or even, how we have the issues with drag queens now. There's so much backlash against drag queens. And so you're right. I think there is something about women and femininity that really frightens patriarchy. And then as biological males begin to perform that seems to be an even higher threat, or a more it's like, oh, they're infiltrating us now in some way, right? Like we're losing a battle,
Yes.
of some kind.
Yes. Yes.
And and yet at the same time you have this idea that women are weak and women are soft and women, so it's like a weird it's a disconnect. Why are you afraid of the thing that's supposed to be weak, soft, blah 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 blah? I don't know. I find that an interesting juxtaposition, and I don't know that we have a clear answer from so-called, let's say, patriarchal men, because obviously they're not self-reflective. It seems to be an unconscious, subconscious, and then conscious fear, backlash, ego issue. And the ancients did not seem to have those issues. They did not. Well, I agree with you that they didn't want to give women like rights to vote and in the Senate and things like that. They saw women as property. Well, especially as we move forward through into the modern period. But gender and like intimacy and performance, they didn't seem very disturbed by that. I mean, think about all the male actors that performed, in all the women's characters, right? Because male actors performed in nature. And then, like we said, priests that performed at rituals, priests
It
that,
becomes such an interesting thing to
right?
think about because I often think about like the god Dionysus, who's
Yeah.
often described as effeminate to the point of where it's even a punchline, like in Aristophanes' Frogs, when he dresses up like Hercules and Hercules laughs at him. Oh, you're still wearing your little booties. Like, what are you doing? No one will take you as me. You're too effeminate.
Yeah.
But it's played as just like a side joke,
Yeah.
right? It's not demeaning of Dionysus. Dionysus is still this magical god who travels to the underworld
Yeah.
to save the city, right? So there's this weird kind of play where there is still some of this kind
Please.
of, gender, like there's these gender dynamics, right? Even like the god Apollo is seen as effeminate and is described that way at times, but it's not necessarily a negative, right?
Yeah. Dionysus, that's a fantastic example. He's one of my favorites because of the androgyny, but also because he is often represented. And again, here we don't know exactly, but let's call him a he, as the Greeks did. Sometimes he has even like breasts, right? He's depicted
Right.
like, so his body, his physical body is a, let's say, biologically fused or fluid. And yet he's so popular. He's so feared because he has this kind of dark sense of humor, right? He just turns people into whatever he wants when he wants, kind of thing. Um, he's a fascinating character. Romans loved him, Greeks loved him, everyone loves him, everyone's fascinated with him.
But at the same time that there's so much love, there's also, like you said, such incredible fear. Because, like, I often wonder if there's an exaggeration about the rites, because the
Mm,
rites were for Dionysus were almost exclusively for women or those who had performing femininity,
that's
right? And there seems to be this constant narrative of men who go and view these rites getting ripped apart and eaten. And I wonder, like, we don't have any women's perspectives on this. So, like, what do you think? Like, do you think this is an accurate description of what's going on in these Maenadic rites, or is this an example of male insecurity and fear of the feminine, of places they're not allowed to enter,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. I think, men have been curious about what women do, even when we have sleepovers, and they'll be like, "Oh, what are you doing? Are you having pillow fights with others?" And and I think two things. I think um, the people, let's say at the time when Maenads were at the peak, the wild or the forest really scared everybody. So going into the forest and into the wild was an act of bravery and courage, but also mystery, right? And especially at night. I don't think at all that women tore animals apart. I think they probably drank and had a good time, and maybe they were intimate with each other, and maybe they did whatever they wanted. But no, I don't think they tore any animal apart. I mean, perhaps they had a barbecue, like, perhaps they hunted something and then had a barbecue. And so, like, I do think that the rest is just the fact that men were not allowed, unless perhaps men performed as women, like what's his name does, whose name is escaping me now, who ends up getting torn apart. Not Perseus.
Pentheus.
Yes, Pentheus. Thank you. Um, so there's this taboo, there's this transgression of liminal space, for women. But yeah, I think that's all in the imagination of, and I think there's a loss of control there, like they're doing something we can't be a part of. That is for fun, because remember, they do have the Thermopylae, for example, that they celebrate. There's lots of rituals for women, the rituals of Iran that are all about birthing and bears, and I think that fits into patriarchy, because it's like, oh, they're doing fertility rites and birthing rites and the right place, right? But this thing in the wild is just fun. It's partying, it's wild, it's unrestricted, and it has no productive, let's use a patriarchal term or a capitalist term, it has no productive quality other than women just being free. And it would not surprise me if people who had were living gender fluid would have been allowed at these spaces. Would not surprise me at all, because I think that women, many women, most women would be open to anybody that joined them in a aggressive, egotistical, right? Not didn't bring on that energy, the masculine energy. But I think you're right. I think it's all about what are they doing without our permission? And the other thing that I think, and this goes for many communities, is that when women gathered, or anyone who's performing living as women gather and they have conversation, it is empowering. And I think that's a danger to patriarchy, right? It's a danger. And I think that was the thing that they really did not like in the end, is that even if you went out once a month to do the rituals, it was still an empowering moment. And then you build
Yeah.
community, right? And you got bigger and you build community and you build community. And I think then it becomes a threat. It's like, why are these women gathering? Even today, women gather and people are like, why? What do you mean?
That's a really good point. I think it's also interesting and important to mention that, especially in the early, like, Bronze era, women were the ones who were producing a lot of the medication and the drugs, and
Mm,
this seems to be a central part of the Maenadic rites.
yes.
And there is this misunderstanding or an inability to be able to do what the women are doing, that because the men don't have access, because this medical knowledge comes out of the necessity of women to control their bodies through their periods, through hormonal control, and through birth.
Yes.
And also just the nature of femininity and being the ones who are gathering and checking all of these different herbs. It seems to be knowledge that for most of antiquity is solidly placed within the realm of women. Even like with the cult of Asclepius and a lot of that Asclepian writing,
Yeah.
you see they talk about how a lot of these higher doctors are women, and they're
Yes.
talking about women's magic, basically, you know?
Yeah. And it's funny they say that because in Epidurus, at the massive temple of Asclepius out there, there was a temple to Artemis, you know? And it's not in the books and it's not something that's popularly talked about. And when I first went there, I thought, oh my God. And I think Hecate is there. Of course, she's there because of that whole pharmakeia. And you're right, like this idea that and think about all the male Greek philosophers or early so-called doctors that were taking apart bodies, that were trying to figure it out, right? Like they were trying to figure it out. And they probably, or they might have seen women as competition because also people went to women because they trusted them of all genders. Probably, you know, if you were sick, you would go to more likely to a woman rather than some dude that's chopping up bodies and going, I don't know, I think your liver is an issue, or I think this is an issue, right? Bile is blue and green and all these things. And so, yeah, maybe they would have felt threatened or they were trying to overcome or become part of the so-called medicine field. And here are these women in the way, you
Right.
know?
I also wonder because we have this strong mythological tradition, like within
Mm.
the epics of witches, right? Like Circe and
Yeah.
Medea, who are using pharmakia to enslave men, like especially Circe. She's turning all these men into pigs and they're described as her sex slaves. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's kind of a wild
Yeah.
image, you know, and
And
you wonder,
you know what's funny about that, Snappy, is that a man writes that. Like,
right, of course.
right? Like I find that even with Amazons and I find out with everything, I find that these are all because all we have is male writings. And so it's like they are obsessed with these magic women, these warrior women, these so-called unnatural women or so-called unnatural men, whatever you want to call it. The language they use around that is sort of taboo, negative language. And yet they write about it so much, you know? Um, and so that always fascinates me. It's like, if, you know, it seems like your fantasy or your, you know, whatever is overpowering your so-called rational mind. That is, even the story when Pentheus is sneaking around is still written by a man who is like trying to tell the story between, you know, the Apollonian and the Dionysian poles. But again, it's this fantasy, it's a male author, right? And so it's fascinating in a sense. I mean, it's a bit sad for us as historians because all we see is through men's lens. And as you know, recently, women are starting to translate again the Odyssey and the Iliad and sort of really put their foot down on some of the translations. But think of all the backlash they're getting for that. So much backlash. Because people are so comfortable with one terminology or one translation. And again,
Yeah.
you know,
And they want to control the narrative, right?
yeah,
And they have
yeah,
this a very strong idea of what Greek society, what the ancients were in general, you know, and they wanted to conform. Like we clearly can see this throughout the entire, you know, one of the big things that you're seeing with a lot of modern scholarship is just going back and checking what all these people had said. And this is such
yeah,
a massive undertaking because most of these texts were
yes,
translated in the early 1900s, and they're
yes.
of that mentality, you know.
Mm.
Right?
So
And we
it's
need, like you
time.
said, women's perspectives.
It's
It's
time.
time. It's time. I'm soon going to be taking the Greek from Dr. Alman and or at least to read it.
Yeah.
So my hope is to encourage others to try to learn to go back to these ancient texts, to go back to these magical texts. They're like to know for yourself what did they say, because that is so empowering to be able to read it for yourself, to know and get your own interpretation, and that's a big thing with Christians is to be able to read the Bible. You interpret it as you need to. They believe that you'll get the message that you're supposed to get, that God intends you to get, right?
Mhm.
Same thing will happen. I can almost guarantee it. And when you learn that the ancient languages and go back and read those texts. you
Yeah.
know?
Well, this
Yeah.
is so important. It's wild you bring up the Bible because the Bible is a perfect example of the erasure of femininity. And we have this through modern scholarship and archaeology with the goddess Asherah,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Everywhere in the archaeological record, nowhere in the biblical text, you know?
Exactly. Although I do think they mention her a couple of times in
Yeah, I
the,
think just
Old
as
Testament.
words, but not as a goddess figure, right?
Yeah.
As a
Yeah.
pole or something.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like so translation is very important, and I think it's something we should talk about more. I mean, I don't expect everyone to learn ancient Greek or Latin or whatever unless you really love it. But at least what we can do is, as people who do learn it, and let's say they're experts in the field, whatever their gender is, give us different sort of little translations of the same text. Then you can read them and make up your own mind without bashing one for the other, right? Without going, oh no, well, she's a woman. Of course, she's going to translate it in a feminine way. Well, the exact same argument applies in the opposite, right? So, but there seems to, yeah, you're right. There seems to be a backlash in the sense that they don't want to let go of the original interpretation. And
Well, there's so much, especially when you're dealing with modern religions, there's so much pushback against, like, we see this a lot with like people who are studies of the classics or antiquity versus people who are studying theology, especially when it comes to something like the Bible. Because if you talk to a lot of Greek scholars or Latin scholars, they'll immediately see mimesis. They'll say these stories are the same stories that we're seeing in the epics retold in a new kind of way to euhemerize and to kind of create this sort of patriarchal framework. But as soon as you start talking about that, they say, the theologians say, no, our culture is original, it's unique, and you're trying to force something external onto our understanding. But
yeah,
all of these people are living in the same society, right? There's still why it blows my mind talking to a lot of religious scholars because if you think about modern anthropology and the modern study of religion, we're constantly looking at how everyone is taking from everything else and everyone is borrowing from everything else. But when we're dealing with these ancient groups, we want to like isolate them and
yeah,
say, well, there's no way the Christians could be listening to the Greeks, and that blows my mind when they were occupied and there were Hellenized Jewish communities all throughout the Christian era, you
yeah.
know,
Yeah. I mean, nothing is in a vacuum. Nothing.
right?
Even the Hebrews, the early Hebrews themselves come out of the Canaanites, and the Canaanites have these massive and so much of their stories is a backlash against Canaanites or saying or to say we are not them, right? We are different than them. And so they write their stories in order to really separate themselves and make sure that people know this community is separate from that community. And so it's like reactive writing almost, right? So context is really important. Understanding where we are geographically, who was around, what were the religions at the time that were influential, right? Like, in the Hebrew Bible, when they tell you, don't go to these Canaanite temples, don't go worshiping with these priestesses, with these so-called prostitutes, which is a problematic translated word. What that really tells us is that clearly this was going on. Like,
Right.
right? Like clearly this was going on if they felt the need to stick it in here. And so kind of reading it like that. So reading it as though what they're telling us about are their concerns, which means it gives us some context for what was actually going on in
Yeah, and
society.
like something like sacred prostitution is so well attested in the
Yeah.
Greek literature, right? Like we have the Syrian Goddess by Lucian, which is talking about the rights to the Biblian Aphrodite and saying how these women would go and sleep with foreign men and get paid to do so as like a sacred right to the goddess, and when you hear talk about them doing similar things at the Temple of Jerusalem, that's not that far away from Assyria, right? you know
Right. 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 And and this is why I think that the problem with the word prostitution is it already has a negative context. And so
Right.
it automatically goes, oh, like that's what they did back then. We are much more civilized now, and we are much, and it really, I don't know, it's really rigid. And so with this, I think we have a lot of problems nowadays with sexuality because of the rigidity So I feel like, in the ancient world, if we were doing a funnel, there was like this open space. Everybody could be what they wanted to be, more or less, not to say there was not problems. But then we went through this dark ages of early or later Christianity, and then more and more strict Christianity. And now we're like trying to open up again, but it's so hard, right? There's so much like resistance. And hopefully we will move forward to become more and more open to these ideas. I mean, I don't know. It's a tough battle that we're all fighting in a way, because it's like the evidence is already there that the ancients had fluidity. Let's just say fluidity everywhere. I mean, when I tell my students about the Spartan marriage ritual, right, where the woman shaves her head and dresses like a boy and gets into bed, and then the young man sneaks into bed because he's so used to having sex with boys, right? Like, my students like just look at me like, what are you talking about? Because Spartans are so exaggerated toxic masculinity when they're represented in Hollywood and things, right? Oh, this is Sparta. And maybe they were in that way. And yet those types of masculinities were also intimate with each other. And this is very widely known. And yet people have this reaction like, what? No. What? I remember now it's more popular than before, but when I first started teaching it, maybe 10 years ago, people would go and look it up and they'd be like, no, I don't believe you. Like, I have to go look up this. I need another scholar to tell me what you're telling.
I remember actually in my first year of university learning about the roles of Spartan women just
Yeah.
in regular life and how they controlled the money,
Yeah.
they owned the property. Many of the women were the most powerful people in their society. And I remember that shocking my mind and just opening up a lot of stuff because you're right, this is not that hyper masculine image that Hollywood depicts us. And it's like that clearly is present to a certain degree in Sparta, but like any culture, it's going to
Right.
have so much more to it, right?
Right. Right. And I mean, and I was just talking to someone a couple of days ago and I was saying, yeah, women could marry two or three men. In fact, it was encouraged that women would marry two or three men because they died so much, one younger, one older, maybe one in the middle. And people go, what? So the human experience and it is similar back then as it is now. It's just that now we've been so constricted and there's so much shame and guilt and like so much that's being passed down, that I think it's important that we keep talking about these issues so that young people especially, but everybody, but young people especially, don't feel like they're outliers, right? That in fact, whatever you're experiencing has been experienced 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, there's
And
a continuum, right, of
right,
human behavior. And people
right,
have always existed in various identities across history and
yeah,
perform different sexualities. And this is never, despite what the governing culture wants to dictate, people
yeah,
have always been diverse and will always be diverse, right?
yeah, yeah.
That's
It,
so important too that we give the space, offer the space. Me and Snappy were talking earlier about when we are allowed the space to have those expressions, however they manifest, the world is just that much more beautiful. And I understand there is a fear of loss of control, if we give more to one area of life or another, but um that's the tower card in the tarot. That is the tyranny that will eventually fall down.
yeah, yeah,
So I think it's important, definitely, everyone keep talking about it and to do your own research. And the more you dig into it, and the more you're going to have knowledge in your backpack to pull out to be able to talk about it, to have the tools to talk about it. So I strongly encourage any listener to dig for yourself and then to talk more about it,
yeah,
especially. Yeah.
yeah,
Within safe space and within reason, we have to be willing to push the envelopes, but we don't want to endanger ourselves.
yeah. And it's interesting that you say that, because, and that thing about control, because one of the things that I'm coming up against sometimes is women who are not really willing to give up control, like feminists who are not willing to give up control of their biologically female spaces. And I'm often disappointed in how do I say this? I like to think of women as communal, as in the sense of like, we are safe space. And I know this is very, very like utopian of me, but we are safe space. I am safe space, right? And so anyone that wants to be part of the group and is safe space too can join. But I've been in some spaces in which women will say, well, I'm not that comfortable with that. And then I'm stuck in this place where I'm like, how is that possible? We fought. So there needs to be lots of conversations, I think, in future creation of more safe space. For me, history helps me because I'll be like, well, we have all these examples in history, and I think we can, recreate this or rebuild on this or whatever. But sometimes when you come up against resistance, it is about control. It really is about, well, this is my space, and I fought for 20 years to get this space, and I'm not giving up, or 40 or 60 years, whatever, and I'm not giving up the space. And there's fear there too. Like,
we also have to be aware that there is a lot of, especially if you're dealing with like older women, there's so much violence that has persisted. And we have to be respectful of people's lived experiences. We don't want to let their experience, ruin a safe space. But at the same time, right? Like, I understand where a lot of these, like in my experience, the women who have pushed back, it's been because they were abused or they feel threatened by masculinity. And that is a very real thing that needs to be honored. But we should be able to have a discussion about this and approach each other as individuals and come to an understanding of some kind.
Yes.
And this would be healing for everyone. Like, because we're all abused. The reality in my experience is that everyone, regardless of sex or gender, is abused by the patriarchal systems.
100%. Yes, 100%. I love that, Snappy. I feel like you're so much kinder than me sometimes. Sometimes I get very like, what is the rationale of this? Tell me and I think you're right. I think a lot of that comes out of trauma, because the fear is always like, oh, am I safe in this space? And I'm like, yes. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And you're right. Like, a lot of us come out of trauma. And so our very first especially feminists that came, 50 years ago, 40, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago. I don't know how old people might be. I think they had to fight a whole different fight, and they carry the scars of that fight.
Or that it will like lessen them somehow in some way. Like if they give just a little bit of control up, that it'll lessen them somehow or take from them somehow.
Yeah.
It's also important though that we have these broad conversations too, because oftentimes these women who are critical of, trans women or non-binary people are also then critical of like cis women who are lesbian but are more masculine presenting. And that's a huge issue in and of itself, right? Like, no one is a monolith, especially women. And like, what about trans men? What about non-binary? What about masculine women? Do they not have a place? Are you going to feel threatened by them? And it's like right now with a lot of these gender laws, it's trans men and masculine women who are on the brunt of the abuse, as well as trans women. But like, we have to acknowledge, like, I have a couple of cis friends who got shouted out going to the bathroom by other women because they have short hair. And they're, and it's just like, it's such a wild thing because, we're starting to see this backlash where people want gender to be a certain type of performance. And, people aren't like that. Everyone's kind of individualistic.
Yeah. And it's funny because I sometimes say, we spent, let's say, the 1970s to the 1980s talking about how gender is a performance. And now there seems to be this idea that, oh, well, now everybody's using gender performance to like perform some other thing for themselves, like to use it in a sinister way. sometimes I'm thinking to myself, "Ooh, this is such a circular argument, you know? I mean, let's just let people be who they are, you know, like, and
Yeah, you see this
yeah,
a lot with like the study of art, right? Like especially like pop art from the 80s and 90s, where you would see so much gender bending, right? Or
right,
gender nonconformity, or even, but there was no acceptance yet, at least within the mainstream, for trans identity. So you don't really see that. And then you
yes,
see a lot of like, especially I see this often among young trans people where they're looking back on these figures from the 80s, 90s, 70s and are seeing them as trans. Like a big issue recently came up with Kurt Cobain. Kurt
yes,
Cobain,
I saw that.
they have his journals published and he talks about this like, I'm not going to speculate about anyone's gender, but he clearly has this strong love for femininity and he performs femininity often.
Right,
So I can understand why these trans people are looking to this person and are seeing themselves in them. And they're seeing someone who wasn't able to come out of the closet. Now we don't know because they weren't able to express it. But
right.
there's such a extreme backlash to these young people who are saying, well, maybe Kurt Cobain was trans. And then you have this screaming fest like, how
Yes.
dare you attack our masculine rock god, you know?
I saw that. I saw it all over TikTok. I saw it all over. And yeah, and you're
I
right.
didn't
Like
see that.
it's so hard to know, right? Yeah. And also, so that a lot of the backlash that I saw was like, oh well, he was performing femininity as a type of activism. Okay. But maybe he was also really enjoying performing femininity and maybe he wanted to be more fluid but couldn't say so and yet performed it as active. Like again, yeah, I agree. Like we are sort of making
Assu-
these assumptions.
yeah, assuming would be like, well, Courtney was very overbearing. I mean, most any time she was seen in public. So does that mean, should we just assume that, she was more masculine? Maybe she was more masculine in the relationship. Yeah, we don't need to assume because that just gets us in trouble.
Yeah.
Well, also like what I see with a lot of this stuff with gender performance and with sexuality is that a lot of people are so oppressed, right?
Yeah.
Are so closeted either by their own psychological stuff or because of the culture or religion or what have you that's been pressured upon them, that they have this innate backlash against everything
Yeah.
that could be possibly going out against that,
Yeah.
so they want to, in my mind, I look back at all these rock stars who are clearly dressing feminine and clearly embodying this kind of feminine perspective. And I see that as part of the show, and that is femininity.
Right.
But so many, especially men, want to look at that and say, no, that's the most masculine thing ever. It's like, of what
Which
world?
again, yeah,
Mm-mm,
again, it's like
mm-mm.
what? Like this is just cognitive dissonance. Like what?
No, there's
Yeah.
even a genre music called the hair bands. I mean, that's very rock glam.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And and it's about that frivolity, of course, and not everyone, I'm not saying all these people are trans, but the point is that we can have this gender fluidity and we can play with these things and we can embrace femininity as an empowering artistic performance. Why not? Right? And like, why can't we talk about these things and what they mean? But as soon as you start to talk about them outside of this performance of power, right? Rock music is only about power, then people get upset about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I,
Mhm.
And
I think
it's
that's the trap of patriarchy where, that we're all still stuck in it. We're all still
right.
stuck in it,
Right.
And it's
Maybe
Um,
we
like,
need to think about why it bothers us so much if we see someone dressing or acting a way that we don't approve of. Maybe we should just spend a little bit of time in front of the mirror and say, ask yourself, why does this bother me so bad? Get down to the root of the issues that you are finding that's arising within your being, that's causing outside disturbances for you. And that goes with just anything, not just, how someone else is acting or is dressing, but, you know, anything really. But
yeah.
that takes some self-reflection, and that also takes enough intelligence and forethought to be able to do that too. Don't you
and
think?
it brings me back to the antiquity stuff. Like you had earlier brought up Patroclus and Achilles, and this is one that causes so much
So much.
animosity,
Yeah.
right? But it's like Achilles was raised as a girl,
Right.
right? And dressed as a girl, lived as a girl until a sword was flashed in front of him and they suckered him off to war. And
Right.
then when he dies, they they mix his ashes with Patroclus's and bury them together, right? Like maybe they weren't like lovers in the way we would imagine gay lovers are today, but there's clearly more than just friends,
Oh,
right?
I I find that, I mean, I don't even know what to say to that, because sometimes to me it's so clear that they were lovers, and yet people are, you're right, they're so upset. But and then I think about, well, Homer wrote this and he put in these sort of implications, and the audience would have automatically recognized this relationship as more than friends. Would have been totally fine and certainly entertaining, because it seems like he spends a lot of time on Achilles' personal life, right? So it's us. Like, we are looking back and going, oh no, absolutely not. Couldn't have been. But actually, it most likely was. I mean, for me, I have no doubt these two were lovers. Uh, but my question is always like, why does it bother you so much? Is it because Achilles is like the epitome of so-called masculinity, and now you realize that actually masculinity is being performed and can be performed with all of these other varieties, like loving other men? Or is it because like your warrior culture is now falling apart? Or like, what is the thing, like Buffy's saying, like, what is the thing that hurts you about this?
And what blows my mind, it's like you guys don't even know Achilles. Achilles is never a masculine figure, right?
Right?
Like
He
Hercules,
doesn't
you
want
can
to fight.
argue,
He doesn't
right?
want to fight already. He doesn't want to, he's just like, I don't want to be a part of your thing at all.
No, he doesn't want to be there for any of it, and he was happy living as a woman, right?
Exactly.
Which is like when people hear that, they go, "No, that didn't happen." I'm like, "Go read the text; it's right there, plain as day." And even Hercules, who is this embodiment of the masculine, has male lovers,
Absolutely.
right? You
Yes.
know,
Yes. Yes.
and it's
I
very,
always want
very
to
clear.
I always want to tell the story of Hercules, because I find him fascinating. In some ways, he's such a jock, he's such a typical jock. But then again, this is the beauty of it. He's so complicated. He has all these lovers, and then he kills his family, and then does all this thing to overcome it. And he just seems like also a really tragic, tortured soul, right? And
So
at the same
much.
time, like kind of a bit of a buffoon. Like when he gets mad, he destroys everything. And that really is like a human's experience is so multi-layered. I think that maybe the Greeks, well, not maybe, but they tapped into something that they really enjoyed seeing, that for some reason we no longer allow ourselves to enjoy seeing. We like things that are very marvelly, like here is a caricature of a man, here's a caricature of a woman. Oh, if a woman is a hero, then she has these very masculine traits. Like, it's very caricature and very one-dimensional. And I think those are the stories we are used to, and perhaps other ones that complicate that, people don't react too well to. It seems like they don't react too well to.
100%. Like I know, like when I first was getting into a lot of this, I kind of avoided Heracles, because I thought, oh, this is the masculine jock who gets drunk,
Right.
because that's how he's depicted in media. But then when you read it, it's like, yes, he does do that, but there's so much depth there.
Yeah.
Like I keep going back to Aristophanes' frogs, because there seems to be this parallel between him and Dionysus, where
Yeah.
they're almost seen as the same character, or two sides of the same coin, is the
Yeah.
implication, right?
Yes,
Because why else could Dionysus dress up like Hercules and go to the underworld,
that's
right?
right. Yeah. And actually, now that you say that, I love that, because it's true. I mean, in the sense they have a similar parentage. Well, Zeus,
Mm-hmm.
but Dionysus has sort of, he's a divine being. Well, of course, Hercules is a semi or a demi-divine being. And one is more cunning, while the other one is a bit less cunning. But it is an interesting juxtaposition of, like, let's say, masculinity or crossing the lines, because they both kind of have these taboo areas in their personalities. Yeah. Imagine making a film. I always say, like, when they make Hollywood films and things like that, they really need historians on there to really tell the story as it is, because the story is so fascinating. But obviously, the politics of making and telling stories
Right.
is about control, right?
Right, right. Because when people watch something, even if it's a bad documentary, they will often take that as at face value and see it.
Yeah.
Like
Well, we
Gods
see
of
this.
Egypt, people were in an uproar about, the the ethnicity of the
Yeah.
people, right?
Yeah.
And that was like a huge, huge issue.
Yeah.
So yeah, they have to have that PC. They gotta keep it PC, always PC.
Or sometimes we hear kind of a flip on that. Like I remember I first heard the discourse about Northman before I watched The Northman.
I haven't seen it.
And you need to see it because
Okay.
it is very much a masculine kind of warrior fight movie. But there's a lot of subtlety and historical nuance in there. There's a transgender shaman who the hero goes and meets. And there's depictions of the goddess throughout, and there's all of this kind of drug imagery and going into these hallucinations, and it really reminds me the story, because it's a retelling of the story of Amleth, but it's very similar to like the Oresteia, this idea of blood feuds and having to the cost of blood feuds, right? And needing to kind of let all of this stuff go. And at the end of the story, it takes the feminine, just like with Athena and the Oresteia, to kind of break this whole mode. But at first, I avoided this movie because I thought it was going to be just a Viking hack and slash movie. But then it was like it's very well done for what it is, and there's a lot of nuance of characters, and there's very strong women throughout, and there's even gender diversity.
Oh, okay. Maybe I will watch. I thought the same thing. I was like, oh, I
Me
can't see
too,
it.
maybe I'll watch it.
There's some
We
cheesiness.
we
There's
need
a
we need to
fight.
get together after and have a conversation about this.
Yeah, yeah, it's a wild movie. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it's better than the discourse was. Everyone was oh, this is a white man's movie, you know and I went into it thinking it was going to be like the 300, and
Yeah.
it was not the 300. Like the 300 is awful in my
So
opinion.
bad.
you know
So terrible. Yeah.
Kind of like, here, little wife, I'm leaving. I'm going to go run this army. They're there.
What's
Yeah.
what they do to the Persians in that movie and to
Oh,
Xerxes? Like, oh my
Xerxes.
gosh.
Yes. 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 And I'm a little bit also sometimes torn about the representation of Spartan women because again, it's Athenian men writing about them and they come off very like, oh, my son only returns to me if he returns victor on the shield. And I'm not sure, like I'd like to think, again, there's no real evidence, but I'd like to think that they could also have been soft and warm and loving and yet still tough. Like it's like these caricatures, these one-dimensionals. Like if a woman is performing masculinity, she's got to be like the warrior men, and never mind the 300 and how they're depicted. There doesn't seem to be any room for complexities of these humans. And never, yeah, and the depiction of Xerxes, my goodness. Um, you know,
He
that's
come in, he come in like an alien type being that was super tall and just
yeah.
I
I mean,
was like,
he was really pretty, he was really
yeah,
pretty, but I
very
was like,
very alieny type
You get the
though. Like,
feeling though that there's a clear dichotomy being
yes,
driven in the narrative. While
yes,
they're not explicit, just the way that these two cultures are contrasted. One is evil, one is good, one
yes,
is effeminate and debaucherous and extravagant. The other
yes,
is refined and
yes,
humble and all this stuff, right? It's like
yes.
it just gets into this culture war stuff. And I'm like, why did you need to go there? And also, it's like, what about all of the other people who fought at Thermopylae? Why does no one ever mention all of the Hippolytes or the all of the other different city states who were there? There were hundreds of other people who died at that fight, not just 300 Spartans, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and my new I have on my list for the next few episodes to do Artemisia, the warrior, because twice now. So in 300, the second one, they did a whole movie about her, which was just they do a whole scene where they talk about how she was violently assaulted, and they do a whole scene in which they describe this fictional traumatic event that in such gore And it drove me nuts. So I was going to do a whole episode on who she really was, you know, historically speaking, and what we know about her. And why does Hollywood feel the need to make women tough by putting them through sexual assault? Like, it feels like that's a toughen up thing, you know? And it drives, every time I see this cliche or this motif or whatever you want to call it, it drives me a little bit nuts. But again, it's the same liberty. You take this liberty with history. And then my problem, okay, artistically, I don't care, but my problem is that other, let's say, young people or people watching it who don't have the time to go do the background start to be in like that, this is thinking this is a true story.
Right.
And that's when and that's when I think you have these people that come into your comments and are like, oh, this is not accurate. What makes you an expert in this? And this is not, and so then, yeah, you're fighting with people who really you don't need to be fighting with, because they've just seen a bunch of films and they think that this is an accurate portrayal, and it causes a lot of, right? It
causes so many issues, right? And it's like, it's something we see with a lot too, with any kind of historical figure who has been mythologized, right? Like I think of a lot of the Amazonian women, like your book that's coming up on Artemis of Ephesus immediately makes me think of the mystical founder, that, what's her name, Otraya, who's like the queen of the Amazons, but then when you read a lot of the Greek histories, a lot of the later historians dispute this and say, no, the temple was built by the local indigenous people and it's been there since time immemorial, But we still have this image of this magical warrior woman who went and killed and solidified this ritual spot in front of this sacred tree, right?
Yeah.
I think it's when people get emotionally invested in something that they're convinced of it. They feel it. If they feel it in their heart, if you grab, like, the music in the movies is also geared toward, grabbing your emotions and pulling at your heartstrings, or filling you full of pride or love, joy, whatever. So when you get emotionally invested into something, your mind and body kind of align and kind of locks you in, and you don't have any elasticity to make it to integrate other thoughts in with it, So, and I think that the more passionate we are and the more emotional evoking we are with the way we talk about it, the way we present it, and what we show people, and we grab their emotional investments towards digging and doing your own investigations, and to seek it, we'll get further.
What you're saying is 100% true. And I just keep thinking, like, going back to earlier parts of our conversation, we have to remind ourselves that these texts are largely written by men and are largely mythologized, and they're supposed to shock and awe. They're almost like, a lot of them, especially like the Amazonian literature, it's colonial literature, right? They're otherizing. They're talking about barbarian. They're saying that these women, anyone who lands on their shores in Crimea gets put on a pike. They're saying the women kill their own male sons, that they cut off the breasts, and like, there's no evidence for that. Like, there is evidence that the Scythians were wild. Like, I was just reading, we found that they had human skin in their arrow quivers. And like, there are talks of the Scythians scalping people, and they found heads that were scalped. So there is some truth to this. These were very powerful tribal peoples, and they probably were a matriarchal society. But we also have to look at these texts for what they are, right? These are people who probably never even saw the Amazonians, writing about it through second, third hand knowledge, and then are trying to create an image to sell to their local community as a colonizing force, right?
Well, that reminds me of, like, when I found out that Greenland was not green and Iceland was not so icy. I was like, I got it now. I see what's going on here. You don't want me to go sneaking off in the woods having some party good time, so you're going to tell me the boogeyman's out there.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And also, a lot of the stuff that we have is plays. So they're meant for entertainment, literally. It's like, if people in 5,000 years from now find our movies, yes, some of our movies do depict some of our values, morality, stories, heroes, blah, blah, blah. but are they like, can an archaeologist look at the movies and go, yeah, now we know how they lived. They must have lived in this A, B, or C way. Everything must have happened in New York. That must have been a real, aliens tend to show up in New York or LA or whatever. Like, all these sort of
The
assumptions.
alligators.
Right? Yeah. Like just weird stuff. And so, yeah, you're right. Like it's written to entertain too. Right. And in a time where you had to keep people's uh attention, for whatever span of time, and they're sitting in these, stone seats, watching and being entertained. So, sometimes I think about how much we apply, like how much we take plays for fact.
Right.
Athena did this, the Furies did this, Orestes did this, and you're like, but that comes from a play. Like it's like you look at Shakespeare and you go, do you take that as historical fact? So sometimes we forget that a little bit, right? And we go, oh yeah, that's historical fact. And it's all we
Right.
Remind
got.
people that Romeo and Juliet's love is just one aspect of how love can be shown, right?
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
No, it's so true, right? And like, yeah, people forget too, like the plays were tragedies or they were
Yeah.
comedies, exaggerated. And
Yes.
all of the authors describe them as exaggerated. Or
They were
even
trying
the
to win
epic,
prizes. They were trying to win prizes with these.
right? Right. And in the middle, they're doing satyr plays where they're bringing out giant phalluses and hitting each other. Like this is not the kind of world that we picture in our minds often.
Yeah.
And it was also a sacred thing, and everyone's drunk and high, right? Like it's
Yeah.
totally different realm to us. So there's also like a big thing that I notice in a lot of mythology is a lot of that mystery language that gets taken as literal when
Yes.
you have to wonder, like, are they getting at something that's more metaphysical? Like the constant image of ripping apart with the maenads, I think is probably largely more to do with the ripping apart of Dionysus by the Titans, and more to do with this idea of descending from creation, like you see with Phanes, where Phanes rips himself apart to become the unfolding of creation. But it's hard to say, but there's a reason why these images are so predominant, I think.
Yeah. And I like that idea. And of course, there's a big argument that, of course, Dionysus later on inspires a lot of Jesus's rituals, especially the eating of the body. So that's interesting that you say that, Snappy, in the sense of like, if you're tearing apart and eating, perhaps you're tearing apart the God in a sense too, and consuming. And there's that consumption idea. And then later on, like when I tell my students, like, yeah, Christians metaphorically eat the body and blood of Christ, but it's still a cannibalistic ritual that's rooted in ancient, lore about ingesting divines or ingesting a hero and they just kind of look at me like, what? Like, what? And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if that kind of consumption is part of Dionysian rites. Um, yeah, again, we don't know because we don't actually, the Maenads didn't write us anything, unfortunately. And that's the other mystery, is that we don't have anything written by women. Well, a little bit by Sappho, but um, that told us what's going on, even in the
Yeah.
temples. That's my frustration with the temples of Artemis, is like, yes, okay, birthing rites were done here. Well, like what? Or, transition rites were done here. Like what? What were they doing? We don't know.
This is one thing I wanted to ask you about because I've gotten a lot of pushback is, on one hand, we have these priestess women who are described in male literature as the most important and powerful people in the world, practically, that everyone defers to. But then they're not writing anything down and they're not involved in the actual direct political landscape. So, like, in your opinion, how much power and how much prestige do you think these priestesses have?
Hmm. That's a good question. Okay, so I think the fact that they're not writing anything down is purposely, because we know that women knew how to write. Many women knew how to write, especially elite women who sometimes were priestesses. So we know that they knew how to write and they knew how to do math or whatever. So I think they're purposely not writing anything down, because I think this period, and maybe even several thousand years back, whatever's a mystery tended to be passed down verbally on purpose as a mystery. Um, And I do think that some of these women, depending when we're talking about and where, but if men could come to the temples, let's say, if it's not just a own women's only ritual, I do think they had some power in conversation. Like even today, in the sense of, you go someplace, you eat, you relax, you drink, you start talking politics. Oh, Joe of this family has this thing, and I mean, this still happens today in Europe and everywhere else. Like the interconnections that happen when you're gathered, whether it's for a ritual or a celebration. So I think even though they didn't have like literally political power, they had influence, depending. Like some temples, of course, were much more popular and some priestesses more. Um, then again, if
Because
we
we
look at the
do.
oracle, sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was just going to say we do see things like the oracles of Delphi
Yeah,
basically dictating when wars can happen or
yeah,
when you should go to war. Or, there's that famous story again with Julian that Julian tells where he talks about how the Romans go and they get the statue of Cybele, they bring it to Rome, and it's this whole big thing. And so there seems to be this like, and that changes the entire religious landscape of Roman culture. So that's a huge cultural shift dictated by some priestesses.
yeah.
But outside of that, it's hard to say what kind of power is happening,
It's hard to
right?
say, yeah, because everything's behind the scenes. And there is also the possibility that there are some scholars that say the male priests, for example, the Oracle at Delphi, translated the oracle's words, and therefore they held power at Delphi. So it was maybe more male power, right? Because apparently they were spewing so-called gibberish, right? So I think it depends. I think it depends. But the Vestas, for example, in Rome, were allowed to, speak with men, have conversations with them. Who knows what they whispered in their ears, and who knows what intrigue was going on back then.
And then most of them after they aged over 30 or so, they would get married to very powerful men and they would still play within Roman politics. So I think the Vestas clearly had serious power, but we
Yeah.
don't have things written by them. So
No. It is the epitome of my frustration that I can, and sometimes you'll have locals telling you stories today, and they say, well, it's been passed down for generations, and that's really wonderful, right? But like how do you use that as evidence of the ancient world? Very problematic, you know what I mean? And so a part of me wants to believe that this has been passed down for generations since the Bronze Age. But has it? Like, so we don't really have, and they didn't write anything down. And if you think about it, even today, women tend to tell their stories orally to each other and keep secrets in that way, right? Like,
Mhm.
even in families, mothers and grandmothers and daughter, they tend to keep oral narrative. And I mean, what can we do? Maybe we'll find some more stuff. I don't know. Or maybe a student of mine had said a while back that the women at this, and this was something she had sensed through her intuition, so not an academic thing, but she was saying, what if they left? Like, what if they thought they were leaving us clues in the artifacts they left, in the art they left, because in their mind we would have, understood them, but we've been so far removed that
So
now we
this is
look
a
at.
big contention of like Dr. Amen. So Amen
Oh,
is super into a lot of the study of the mystery rites. And
mhm,
he, being a linguist and looking at the etymology, he looks for what he describes as the Orphic Vox, which
right.
is kind of like these images and poetic language that is clearly related to these magical rites that is kind of hidden in plain text. And he claims, and he has some good proof for this, that this connects to a lot of these goddess cults, specifically like the mother goddess cult and like the Hecate and Medea and all this. But I wonder how long that persists and where it happens and what's actually going on, you know, because again, the problem with the mystery is that it's a mystery. And most of the images that we have for the mysteries are then, they're the Christians blaspheming the rites. Like we
That's right.
have Apollodoros who tells us that with the rites of the Great Mother, the drum is a passcode to get into Elysium. But what that actually means, I don't know. He was making fun of it. He's saying that they're using the drum as a bowl and it's representative of the goat and of this eating of the food, which to me screams Dionysus and these ripping apart rituals. But in what sense? I have no idea, you know?
Right?
Right?
Like, are they using a goat skin drum? Does the horns or the bones, is that part of putting the drum together? Sinew, all that? Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it gets weird too, because they're always saying, do you have the ears to hear? And they're using all of this coded language. And then even if they are encoding some of them, are they encoding all of the mystery? And then we
Yeah.
have to contend with, there's all this talk too about the role of the satirist. There seems to be these people who are trying to discourage people from uncovering the mysteries. So
Yeah.
would purposely lie about what was going on too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is the thing. I don't think they could have predicted where humanity went, let's say, at least at
Yeah,
a certain point in time. And so I like this idea that perhaps they tried to leave us or assume they were leaving us messages and assume that the story would go on. And the tragedy is that it didn't. Like there was a disconnect at some point, and now we're trying to piece it back together. And sometimes I say, well, maybe it doesn't matter if we piece it exactly as it was, but then, the academic in me goes, but I want to know the little details of every move.
right. Right. It's this one thing, like I always think like, oh, life is always in flux, and the goddess is always ever present. So even if the rites change, right, the material world isn't changing in a sense. But I also think though, like, what are your thoughts on something like we see? I don't know if you're familiar with like the American anthropologist Charles Leland, who made all these claims in the 50s about the cult of Aradia in Italy, and claiming that this goddess paganism around Diana Artemis survived in Italy. And then you have a lot of this modern goddess occultism that is real strong about this. What do you think about those kind of movements or that kind of anthropology, if you're familiar, of course?
So not, I've heard a little bit about this cult of Aradia. And so I do know that in Italy and in Sicily, the Diana movement did, especially in Sicily, did survive. How did it survive? Is it in the way that he writes about it? That is a little bit unclear because again, it's a mystery culture and they didn't really share too much. Um, and I don't know how I feel about the modern reproduction of goddess culture. In part I feel like yes, let's do it. There is maybe some warning signs because some people really kind of either go too far out there or they're taking advantage of some things to kind of make up things. So I think we have to be vigilant in like figuring out what is genuine. But I'm not. I feel like there's a revolution coming, a goddess revolution. It's a quiet one. It's not a war. It's not loud, but it's quiet in the sense that more and more women are turning to the goddess, more and more women and others are turning to the sacred feminine and however they want to approach or join communities. And that I think that's fantastic. Like I'm totally for more and more goddess festivals. Yes, you have to be careful, but I think even in the ancient world, in every religion they had, because they had so many, you got to kind of pick what you wanted, what community you wanted to join, what God you wanted to worship. That is all you always have to kind of decide that for yourself,
Right. I
right?
always think of like Apuleius, who joins like 50 different mystery
Yeah,
cults, right?
yeah. Like I think we have to be a little vigilant in our own, and maybe some people are called to 10 gods. Maybe I'm called to only two. Um, but I can't say I see it yet as a bad thing because I think we need a refresher. We need to end and collapse, let's say one system, or it's coming to an end, I hope, and begin trying something else, because it's not
Right.
working. Whatever we're doing is not working. It's terrible.
No, and I think the lack of the feminine is a major aspect of this.
Yeah.
Whether it, and I mean this exists in hard science as well as in like the more Abrahamic religions, where there is just this removal of the feminine or a reduction of the feminine. Like you see a lot of that goddess worship survive in Christianity, but it is only as this archetypal virgin mother.
That's
You
right.
lose out on the sex and war aspects
That's right.
and the other, the like the goddess is such a nuanced, goddesses are such nuanced figures,
Yeah.
and there's such a wide variety in the ancient world. Yet in modern times, women can either, you can be a mother or a virgin or you're evil, right? It's like
Absolutely.
Yeah, my experience, like in the local pagan communities, since, the turn of the century was like they were not, I like to use the term holy whore, and they were not ready for the holy whore. They were still very much trying to be pagan, free, and more liberated and open in their beliefs, but still holding to the, well, uh, let's not get too wild now. Let's not let things get too out of hand, or let's not be too promiscuous, or don't dance too often, or you know what I mean? So even though I've seen it grow exponentially, in the past 23 years.
Yeah.
We still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
A long way to go.
Yeah. One of my challenges with goddess worshippers, and it's not really a challenge, I love being among them, but it is very much like a love and light situation. And one of the things that's been coming up, and people are open to it, is embracing the multifaceted goddess, the angry goddess, the wrathful. How do we accept this in our, how do we perform some of these aspects of her, or allow ourselves? So I think that's something that perhaps there was a need for a lot of love and light because people were healing and coming out of these very traumatic religions. And now I think I hope like we're able to start embracing all the facets of it and be a more like complete, like allow ourselves to completely surrender to all the aspects of the goddess, I think.
What
Another thing
helped me
that's
with that
okay.
was I like to look at the dark moon Lilith in astrology charts, right? And the Saturn. I look at dark moon Lilith, Saturn, and there's the IC. I forgot what it's called. It's a weird little name. In your chart, those are usually dealing with the shadow, the dark night of the soul and stuff. So when you look at that aspect within yourself and you can help to heal that and integrate that, you're going to be more willing to look at the aspect of the goddess that is very vengeful, that can take life, that can draw blood, and make you want her and beg for death at the same time. You can look at that in a more healthy way and say, okay, it's okay, and it be okay, feel okay to look at those aspects of her.
Yeah, like I think it's really important too that we have these more broad images. Like we can look back to the ancients. We have goddesses like Artemis, who's clearly a goddess of the hunt, of femininity, of that virginity, of separating herself, of this staunch power. And she's such a powerful figure. That's like her essential energy. And people can really connect and embrace that. Or like the goddess Cybele, who is this ruler god, who is a queen, who dictates and has this power, right? And you can see like there's so much nuance that has been not lost, but is it's not discussed enough. But
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to ask you about though, Carla, is like we see a lot in modern paganism this, and I mean the ancients did this too, which is why it gets so complicated, but this taking of these various goddesses and amalgamating them or separating them, like Isis and Aphrodite are sometimes one, or Inanna is sometimes thrown in there. And it gets really complicated when you get something like Artemis at Ephesus, because when I look at that imagery, it screams Cybele, but then they're describing her as Artemis, and then in the modern times you have all of this conflation, you know. So what are your thoughts on that?
So that's a good question because I'm doing this workshop that I'm doing, the goddess migration. This is exactly what we're addressing, although it's 8 weeks. So we're doing a sort of summary version, survey version. This week we're doing Kybele, for example. And so I'm also torn because in the ancient world, you're right, it was very open to this kind of, we have Isis Aphrodite in Greece, right? And everyone was open to those interpretations. And celebrated and built temples and all that kind of stuff. And then by the time we get to the Artemis of Ephesus, you're absolutely right. She carries so much in her from the past, let's say, goddesses that were in this geographical space, Cybele being one of them, Hecate another. And so it seems like that was acceptable. Today, I don't know how I feel about it. Today, I think, again, because we're new to it in a way, I think that people, like, for example, people will say to me, well, I have an altar and I have like 4 or 5 different depictions of different goddesses on that altar, and some of them are for this and some of them. And I think, well, I mean, is it working? Like, I mean, I don't think that goddesses were competitive. I don't think that religions were competitive, although they were exclusive sometimes, right? Like the mystery cults were kind of exclusive for some people. But so I don't know, perhaps we give it a try for a little bit and see how it goes. Like, I do think sometimes like people make it really like cutesy. Sometimes, for example, I've seen TikToks where people are like, tonight I'm gonna sit in the bathtub and I don't know, play with my duck and offer something to Hecate. And sometimes I go, I'm not sure
Right.
about that. But I also feel like, well, Hecate will let you know. Like, I mean, I feel right. Like I feel like the goddesses or the divine, however it expresses for you, uh, will probably take care of whether or not that is something they really enjoy you doing in honor of them. But it does make maybe it's our brain because it's so monotheistically trained, right? Like that maybe we have a little bit of a harder time understanding how could they have just allowed someone to take Isis and then mix Aphrodite and make Isis Aphrodite and celebrate. Like maybe there's a little bit like we are not yet, or we have not yet been able to go, that seemed to be very, very welcomed and no one really judged you for it. Then again, we don't know. It's not like people wrote down, well, they took my Isis. Look at these Greeks. Look at what they did. Look at these.
You could say the same about them building the churches on the sacred pagan
Ugh,
sites too.
and I say it all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. Every time I go to a cave, just a cave,
Mm.
which is supposedly a pagan cave, or it was a real pagan cave, and there's a little church right there. And it drives me nuts. And I don't want to take on the Greek Orthodox Church, but sometimes I'm like, really though? So the pagans have nothing. They're living in this nonsensical religion, according to you, and yet you've got to place something of your own, almost like peeing on everything, right? Like that patriarchy thing, right? You got to place something of your own just in case. Just in
Well,
case.
to me it screams colonialism, right?
Oh,
It's
so much.
just because it was so old, we don't look at it through that lens, but this is how they were able to over time take a pagan community and Christianize them. They took the goddesses, equated them with saints. Like I look at Saint Catherine of the Wheel, she's sitting there with the ion wheel. Like this is clearly the goddess Fortuna or Tai Chi, right? And it's like how, but now everyone knows this is Saint Catherine of the Wheel because it's been so long. That whole pagan tradition has been lost,
Yeah.
and it's sad, but at the same time, like this is the world we're dealing with now. And it's interesting because we get a lot of these modern pagans who kind of play with Christian imagery, and they
Mm.
play with Christian versions of the goddess,
Yeah.
or you get weird ones like Santa Muerte, where it's both Catholic and pagan at the same time,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I used to have a
Well, also,
teammate
I wanted
named
to ask,
Santa Muerte.
yeah, I wanted to ask you because since you're doing this goddess project and you're going to Crete, which is just incredible, I'm so amazed by that. It's so
Yes,
beautiful. But
amazing.
just being on YouTube, I get backlash talking about Hellenismo and talking about the ancient gods as cultural appropriation. Have you been facing any of this? And what is your thoughts on appropriation?
I don't, so okay, so talking about and telling stories of the ancient Greeks, I would never find that as appropriation. When I was getting my PhD, I did, because I was always in love with mythology and especially like indigenous stories and things like that. And when I was deciding what to do, I did think about um I want to do something that I can then claim some type of ancestry to, since I come from the Black Sea area and things like that. But yeah, I don't know that I would call talking about the history and telling the stories or any of that appropriation.
It's
And I
more
don't
so
know
what I
that.
get. It's like young people who see it's become a trend, especially like on TikTok, where if people like if I'm worshiping Artemis, people will say, "Well, are you Greek?" you know,
But not only
and
Greeks worshipped Artemis, so
right, this is
mm,
where it gets interesting, and it's like, what do you mean by something like Hellenism? This was a Mediterranean wide philosophy, right?
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
I
yeah.
wouldn't even call it a religion because it predates religion, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I do think that people get a little caught up in that. Yeah, I don't know where that line would be. But I can't imagine that telling the stories or talking about these or even worshiping these goddesses. But again, I'm in that space where I feel like you could worship whoever you feel called to worship. Not everyone agrees with that. So some people are much more conservative about that. Um, but again, I don't know that you can, unless you're dishonoring in some way this divine being, which of course no one who worships them is, then yeah, no, I think that, I mean, there are sometimes conversations when we talk, people will ask me, can you do Eastern goddesses like Hinduism and Buddhism? And I say, I mean, I can if you just ask me to talk about them, but I don't feel like I should do it as an expert. Like, do you know what
Right.
I'm saying? Like, because then I feel like, well, there's probably a lot of experts in that field that are, that can very clearly know the language, can talk and say all the right names. Do you know what I mean? So, in that way, as an academic, I feel like I have that responsibility. Like, I don't want to claim that I'm an expert on these divinities. I'm not. And when I claim that I'm an expert on something, I want to be able to be an expert on something. But like talking about them and having conversations with others, I would welcome that opportunity or people that know more about it and are more read in that area, right? Like
Mhm.
sometimes we lose a bit of our humanity and being able to have discussions about things and we get very
Right.
attached to labels, right? Like,
Mhm.
you know,
I think things
so
become it becomes way too gatekeepy, and it becomes
yeah,
this idea of cultural supremacy rather than cultural exchange. Like we
yeah,
were talking about earlier, all of these cultures are intermixing and intermingling and sharing ideas. Like Cybele or Cybele starts out as a Phrygian god, then becomes a Greek god,
yeah.
and then becomes a Roman god. Who
Exactly.
who who has rights to worship Cybele, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly, exactly. So I do maybe again it's not, maybe it's not so much a patriarchal thing, well, though that's probably the umbrella, but also a capitalist thing. Like this
Yeah,
is my property, right?
right.
And I do think it's also because of so much colonialism, right? Like that history of colonialism and all
You
of
do have
that.
to be aware of like there is real
Yeah,
appropriation that happens and a lot of lying that happens. Like we were
yeah,
earlier talking about like scholars misrepresenting the texts and whatnot. In my experience studying Indian religions, like this was far more apparent in the Indian traditions because the Indian traditions are active and living. And as the Indian people started to challenge colonialism, they could go and say, look, just because you translated our text didn't mean you understood it. And you
right.
armchair anthropologists were sitting in Germany when you did it. You never even consulted a single religious Indian. Like you clearly have it wrong. But
Yeah,
there's never been that on the Greek side because there's so much distance in time from when these religions were practiced.
yeah,
So a lot of that translation remained in the armchair people at Oxford or in Germany or
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
right? So there is something to be said, but I feel like we need to have this ongoing cultural exchange, right? Like and it's going to happen no matter what, as long as it's a give and take, right? Like
yeah.
we like to view it as like my culture versus someone else's rather than we both come together, exchange ideas, and are better for it, you
Yes,
know?
yes. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
And that's the
Yes.
way it should be.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you more about the temple at Ephesus because it's such a wild location because it's widely regarded as one of the oldest temples in the pagan world, and then it's also one of the most prominent ones that falls to Christianity. You have all of this mythology about John the Beloved and Mary going there and destroying it. So it's clearly this incredible cultural place. So can you talk about just the what kind of a place it actually held within the Greek world?
Hmm. Well, so it was a port. So when you go now, it's not a port because it's so far from the water. So it
Mm.
was a port. And so I think for a long time it held political power and financial power because of that. And you know that it was a bank in a way too, that it held all of these goods. Um, it's a good question as to why it was so prominent and so powerful and became so large. And so it could be anything. I mean, the theories range between it was a political move. So, it's this kind of psychology like, well, if this emperor or this person banks here, or worships here, or builds here, so will we. So it was a way to create status. I mean, the gods destroyed it in the end. They burnt it down in like 200 something CE. And so I think the challenge became, of course, Christianity. Although at first, Paul is being run out of Ephesus, but over time, it seemed like that whole area was succumbing more and more to this new god. I'm not sure why that phenomenon was happening. In some ways, I think it was an excitement for a new divinity. In many ways, it was political power again. Um, why was it so big, so powerful? Yeah, I'm not sure, other than just its political prowess and its wealth. And maybe its ancient history. The Ephesians had long, long, long been influential, wealthy, yeah, powerful, a home for the goddess, a home for the mother goddess for a long time. So it would make sense that they kind of hoarded all of the goddess attributes and wanted to be central. It was really their identity. In the way that Christianity's identity for people, for the Ephesians, Artemis was identity for them too. Their birthday was like, her birthday was like a Christmas, long festivals, month-long festivals. So I think that was very unique at that time, in the sense that there had been other goddesses that had those celebrations, but I think at that time, she was one of the most highly celebrated. And so that gives you power. If you're a politician, you want to support some of that, you want to throw some money at it. So maybe this kind of combination of both politics and spirituality and power, maybe a bit of
Yeah,
ownership.
I do remember reading that it became a massive pilgrimage site,
Oh,
like one
yeah.
of the major places where
Oh, yeah.
people would come from all over the
Yeah.
Mediterranean and the Black Sea too. And it seems to be like you're saying, the goddess, the mother goddess,
Yeah.
is such a predominant figure, whether it's like Inanna or Isis or Aphrodite or Artemis or who have you. This is such a gigantic figure, right? Even into the Roman era,
Yeah.
it's kind of surprising that we've forgotten that, like Cybele was the central Roman goddess, right?
Yeah.
It became Sol Invictus just before the Christian era, but that is a much later tradition, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's so interesting. The other thing I really want to ask you about Ephesus is the iconography of Artemis herself, since this is so controversial. Because like reading in text, you read the most wild stuff, just trying to break down this image.
Yeah.
You know, like I've heard claims that those are breasts. I've heard claims that those nodules are beehives. I've heard claims that they're testicles. What do you think they are, or what do you know they are? What does the art the history tell us?
So I'm hoping to prove beyond the reasonable doubt in this book that they are queen bee eggs. So
Okay.
imagine that one of my chapters is going to be somewhat scientific because I've spent so much like looking at bees and talking to beekeepers. And okay, so they're not breasts at all. No doubt about that. They're not breasts because they have no nipples, right? Like the ancient pieces, even though they're copies, they're Roman copies, but they have no nipples. And this obsession with the nipples comes later on in European paintings where they start putting nipples on them. But in the statues that we have, no nipples. So to me, breasts, I know that, and they even talk about, oh, Cybele used to be multi-breasted. I have not seen an actual artifact of Cybele as multi-breasted that predates Artemis. So there are a few where she's got like these bumps on her body, but again, no nipples. And so I'm going to argue that those might be beehives or bee eggs as well, because the bee imagery is so powerful, especially here in Anatolia. And so to me, I have no doubt these are bees. She's got bees coming up the side of her body, right up into the hive, right? Like the bull testicles comes from this idea of the Taurian Artemis, and there is some theory, although no evidence. There is evidence that they sacrificed bulls to her. Well, they sacrificed bulls to lots of people. That doesn't mean that they had bulls on their bodies. Number two, and they say, oh, they used to throw the bull testicles on top of the statue. Like, where? Who says this? Where is this? You know? And what does that have to do with her wearing bull testicles? I mean, it's so it feels now it feels a little silly. I think in the beginning everyone was speculating because we're actually not told what they are. We're actually not told, like in primary text, we're not told what they are. Again, I think because the ancients already knew. They were like, of course these are beehives. She's the queen bee, of course, you know. And they had like honey, and was so much offered to her here, and there was just so much honey imagery in the celebrations. And so perhaps they thought, well, of course they are. Who would think otherwise? And she's not called many-breasted. I mean, that's a later, right? That's a later interpretation. So I'm going to lean heavily towards bees. And if you see the queen bee eggs, which of course were very valuable at this time, I mean, they are exactly like the protrusions that she's wearing. Yeah. And so I'm as you can tell, I'm really, really, really into the queen bee eggs. And I have a feeling that over time, like more and more people are leaning in that way. They're doing their own research and their own stuff. Not so much on Artemis of Ephesus, but when we're talking about whether or not these are breasts or bees, there's lots of talk about it. So I'm gonna do a bunch of presentations and say, like, it just makes no sense that it would, first of all, no way that they're breasts. Someone would have said it somewhere if they were, and there would have been nipples, because there's nipples everywhere in the ancient world. Whenever a breast is uncovered, there's nipples. So it's like they know
And they're
what
constantly uncovering women. So, right.
they know what
I can,
nipples look like.
yeah, I can remember that being my question when I first seen, the goddess. I was like, oh, first glance, naturally you think, oh, well, these must be nipples, but then closer exam, it's like there's no, or it must be breast, but there's no nipples. You realize there's no nipples, and it's like there's no way. There is an Orphic Vox meaning here going on. I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
It's interesting. And then there's a Roman statue where she's made of like black stone. I don't know, you must have seen it, where she has the black face, black hands, and black feet. So if these were breasts, then these would have been black too. Right?
Good point.
Like
Good
all
point.
of
And
her
they stay
skin,
white like
they stay
eggs,
white.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
So all of her skin is shown, wherever her skin is shown is made of this black stone, right? This earthy stone. But what she's wearing on her chest remains white. So no, I don't think I think if they meant breast, they would have added the nipples. I don't think they would have been shy about it at all. And then when I think about Kybele, because people go, oh yeah, she was many-breasted. I'm like, I've been to a lot of museums and I've never seen an image of Kybele with many breasts, not an ancient image. Like modern images and artists have made her in that way. But I can't think of one. And again, I haven't seen every single artifact in the world, but I can't think of one that has like nipples. Maybe I'll allow it. Like I'll give it some room for Kybele because, but for Artemis of Ephesus, none of the statues that we have, not one, of that time have nipples. Not one. So it's all later art, right? The imagination. And the likelihood that these would have been bull testicles is highly unusual, highly unlikely. But again,
yeah, with the bull thing too, I just keep thinking, like you said, it's such a predominant sacrifice. Like it makes it's just a common thing. And I even think the bulls are often associated with bees, right? Like they find right, they find the beehives inside the bull.
That's
So
right.
there's some kind of weird mystery image there, or sometimes the bees are in the lion, which is another goddess image.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And bulls are famous like for their horns and other aspects. I don't know any god that is shown like with bull testicles like on their representation. You know what I mean? So it would have been a very and her priests were called Amelisai, like they're king bees. Like there's just so much bee imagery and bee naming. Um, that to me, I have no doubt that these were bees. But again, as an academic, you can never say 100%, right? You can never, all you do is you go, here's a list of the reasons why I think that. And then a faction of people will agree with you, and a faction of people will go, no, you're wrong. These are bull testicles. Okay.
And then,
So
yeah, for sure. One other thing I wanted to ask you is that often associated with the goddess in this area around Anatolia in the Black Sea and the Middle East and such, we see these meteorite
mm.
cults. Do you notice, is there any meteorite worship going on at Ephesus, or any of the statues made of meteorite or anything?
So there was some talk that the black stoned faces and hands and feet were made of meteorite, and that is sometimes, but again, the ones that we have are not.
Hmm.
Right? So there is some speculation because that's where the Black Madonna comes from too, even though the Black Madonna is also not made of meteorite. But the idea was that there is this black stone in the earth that was so powerful that gave off a vibe or whatever. And they say that the original, wherever that is, because we don't have it anymore, or the inspiration was that meteorite stone. But we have no evidence. So we don't actually have a piece that's made of it at all. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's it's
it
such
could
a
just
bummer
be
because
earthy.
we hear all this talk about these magic falling stars always
Yeah,
associated with the goddess,
yeah,
and we have this story of them bringing the statue even to Rome, but it's gone if it ever existed, right?
yeah,
Or
yeah.
it's under the Vatican. That's
Under
my
the Vatican.
go-to.
Yeah. Yeah. I
That
mean, it's very possible because so much. So, for example, at Jerash, at the temple in Jerash in Jordan. So when I went there, they had this massive statue of Artemis, 2 stories high. Okay. And they go, oh,
Wow.
yeah, well, we don't have the statue. And I'm like, what happened to it? And they're like, we don't know. What do you mean? This is a 2 story high marble statue. How did it disappear? We don't know. And so for sure it's somewhere in some rich man's house. Do you know what I mean? Or like, I feel like there's so many pieces in
Mhm.
hiding or kept. So I'm like, how can someone just walk away with a 2 story statue and no one ever saw it again and no one knows where it is? Like, what?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah, I have no
There are
doubt.
also all these moments in history that are just so terrifying. Like I remember a few weeks back, I was reading about the Catholic Crusade of Byzantium, and
Mm,
the raiders talking about melting down all of the gold and jewels so that they could lug it back. And they're melting down all of this classic Greek antiquity, like antique pieces, right? And you're just like, what did they have and what did they destroy? Like it's just so sad, you know.
yeah,
But that's like anytime you're in history, there's millions of these moments, right?
yeah, yeah. And if
Yeah.
there was a statue made of meteorite, it would have given off some power. And I can only imagine that people would want that.
Mhm.
You would think because like there's so many strong, right? Like I just like the fact that that idea of this meteorite image is so powerful across the Middle East and across that whole region. And then it even survives into Rome with Julian. And there's all this talk about this magic statue. Like, where did it go? Right? You know,
Yeah.
Mhm.
it's just wild to me, you know. And the black stone is such a predominant image of both Saturn and of Rhea and Cybele. So you're just like, I don't know. There's something going on that was lost or is hidden, probably, right? Like maybe it could be in a rich man's house somewhere.
This is where the conspiracies theories start, right? Like these modern cults have these statues at the center of their maybe places. Who knows, And they're like, oh, we have a magic statue. Uh, it's possible. Who the heck knows where they
Yeah.
went? Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. My conspiracy is there's a lot owed to the world that is hidden in the Vatican vaults that should be released and published online.
Agreed.
Almost certainly, right?
I'm
Even if
gonna
they
keep
don't have
talking
these
about it.
articles,
Yeah.
just the books themselves, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, that just makes us all drool. And even though I'm not an academic, I'm a scholar, it makes me drool. I've thought about it for so long, you know? So here's to hoping we just sit that vibe out that that will happen one day.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, guys, you ready to wrap up? I do want Dr. Carla to talk about her project and her
Yeah, I was
book.
going to say we need to talk more about your goddess project
Yes,
in the temple at
and
Crete. This sounds so
I'm
incredible.
so excited for you. I read
Yes.
that and I just screamed with joy. It was
Yes.
amazing.
Yes. So I do. Okay. So I have this dream, so hopefully it comes a reality is to build this temple. So, to buy a piece of land in Crete is not too terrible, but then to build a place that has sort of a meditation space. I dream of building an actual Tholos temple to Artemis. I feel like she gave it to me in a dream, but sometimes I don't want to commit to that because I'm afraid if I can't come through with that, she's going to be like, I gave you this. So I have it in my mind the way that it's meant to be built. And so I would love to have that for people to just come and pay their respects, spend some time and just a connection. And have like an archery maze, but most importantly, a space for people to come and stay and experience the island and the goddess and all of those things. So I have this goal. I have like part of it set, but then it's like, how can I do this? How can I build this? How am I gonna do it? So I'm leaving now in April. I'm gonna go look around. I'm gonna see, what can I do? Where do I start? And then I might try to raise some money and see if that works. I'm terrible at asking people for money, like, but maybe or find some investors or something. So it's like the technicalities of doing it seem overwhelming, you know? But the goal of having people come and stay, relax, meditate, connect, and also visit and having something in honor of Artemis is just it's I don't even know what to say. It would be just everything. So it's my goal right now. That and also I'm going to go and map the temples. So I want to create a Google Doc with all of her temples
Mm,
with pictures that
Oh,
I'm
that's
going to take in
incredible.
descriptions. Yeah, because my goal is to just let people see how many temples to her there were. It's part of my argument that she was one of the most famous ancient goddesses of her time, of the world, right? And so when you see the plethora of temples, I think it's a more convincing argument, right? Not that there's other goddesses that had lots of temples, but this one is mine. So this is my goal. So I'm gonna start when I go in April. I'm gonna look at some land. I'm gonna video and share some videos with you guys. I'm gonna look at some properties. I'm gonna see how I'm gonna do it, and then I guess I'll just move forward one step at a time. And I hope that she gives me guidance in a sense too, right? Like I have to remember I'm not alone. I have to remember like whatever is meant to be is meant to be, and it will be, right? I have to kind of try. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, how will I do all that? What am I saying? You get kind of stressed out, and then I have to be like, if it's meant to be, it will be. So, but that's my plan. That's my goal, and I think it's part of like bringing back the ancient gods because we have to have places to worship them too. Like, yes, we have home altars, which I think are important. Ancient peoples also had home altars, but what about gathering spaces? We need to raise that energy, right?
right,
And
right.
reclaiming these spaces, like
Yeah.
Crete is such a it's just such a beautiful idea because this in many ways is one of the origin places of that entire Greek culture out of Mycenae. You have the snake mother image,
Yes.
right, that is
Yes.
so predominant and so old. So you're going back to like this primal pagan root that is
Yes.
just so beautiful. I love
Yes.
that.
Yeah. And I have it in my mind. And I have this idea of people coming to help build or help paint or help put like so that there's a communal energy too in coming together. So yeah, my goal is to kind of replicate what was happening in the ancient world around temples, which was people would come and stay for a bit and relax and eat and make friends and then also worship,
Mm,
and do so so yeah, that's my goal. This is the
It's
year that I'm starting to work on it.
beautiful. It is amazing and beautiful, and I will grab up my youngin and we'll come over and we'll paint and we'll dig and we'll hoe and we'll hammer.
Yeah, let us know when you get things a
That'd be
little more underway
amazing.
because
Yeah.
we will
Thank
support
you.
you.
Thank you guys. Thank you. I will. I think I mean the necessity of social media has to come. Like sometimes, I'm always like, oh, I don't want to share all of it. You feel this feeling, but I'm like, no, but if I want to have a community, it's gonna have to be shared. And so I'm also learning as I go, because now I'm stepping away and away out of the institution and I'm doing something that's very different. Uh, so I'm hoping that, so I'm just going to share it genuinely and hope that those who are called will come and, right?
Right.
Like,
I think
all
there'll
I
be a
can do.
lot of people who will be super interested because there are so many people who want to go and experience that ancient god and goddess culture. But when you go to modern Greece, it's very orthodox,
Yes.
and all of these places are very museumified, and they don't have any space for people to do that kind of ritual worship unless you're within those traditional Hellenistic Greek religions,
Yes.
right? Which is important, and I have nothing but love and respect. But there is this whole community of people who want to have a little more of a personal, more of a non-traditional kind of spiritual connection. And if you
Yes.
can make a retreat where people can go and experience the land and the goddess directly,
Yeah.
like that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm working on. And so I go there in April for a month, and then I'm going to, one of the things that I'm doing is in order to travel to different places, I've signed up to do lectures on cruises in exchange for room and board. And so they take me to different places. And so I thought, okay, I will lecture and you take me to all these different places. So like to kind of make it affordable. So I'm going to spend some of the summer, and then I'm going to do the temple research and things like that. And then I'll be back in September in Crete, and I'm hoping to stay for a year. And that will give me more time to really look around and see what is it like, because you also have to consider the politics of like, how do you buy a piece of land and how much tax do you have to do all these actual
You have to
technical.
integrate into that community,
Yeah,
right? You don't want to be an outsider if you're going
that's
to move
right.
there.
That's right. That's right. The technical things of, it's like you want to have a spiritual space, but also there's the reality of like, here's taxes. This is how much taxes you're paying, This is how much it takes to bring electricity here and things like that. So, but I'm looking forward to it. Like it
It's
feels
a
like
good
I'm aligned.
challenge,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
something worth pursuing,
I think so. I think so. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then you have I'm cutting this out. The Artemis Center online.
Yes. And that's where, so we're going to do there's another workshop. Actually, there's another workshop that we're going to do, I think sometime in April because I'm in Crete. And so we might do Minoans. Because I'm in this place now where I'm starting to challenge a bit of Arthur Evans' work. And there has been some, especially the palace, the kings. And even I was talking to someone a couple of days ago and said, I don't even know if we should call them Minoans because King Minos, we don't know if he was a real person. We should just call them Cretans. And so, anyway, there's this whole sort of resurgence of looking at these peoples from a more, let's say, authentic perspective. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should do another workshop, like, I don't know, 8 weeks or something.
You so should do one. I would definitely sign. I want to just ask one question,
Yeah.
like, because I was just reading that people are challenging, like you said, Arthur Evans, and they're saying that this may have been like the temple at Gnosis may have been an actual commune,
Yeah.
and that there were many, many people living all together in some kind of non-hierarchical way. What is your
Yeah.
perspective on that?
Yeah, I think so. And so I think so because we have zero evidence of kingship. We haven't deciphered linear A, so we don't know, right? When we will, there will be more evidence, but zero evidence of kingship, zero evidence of anything to do with palaces, zero evidence of class structure, like zero evidence. And in the actual site itself, it is all Arthur Evans' interpretation. Now, we don't want to beat him up. He was a man of his time, but he saw the structure and thought palace. And of course, he used King Minos as a term because it's king, right? But that's a Mycenaean term. That's a colonial term. So the Mycenaeans arrived, they colonized the place, they attached their own, you know, whatever, because they had kings, Mycenaeans had kings. And so there is this revival, and I'm finding it fascinating. And we have, like, on the island itself, there's at least 3 or 4 massive sites that are labeled palaces that have no evidence of it being any kind of monarchy or royal space. So it could have been communal living, and more people are starting to lean on that. But again, the evidence is a bit limited, right? So we don't know. We found like some storerooms. We found maybe an altar. Again, you don't know. Like, so who was living where? We know there were rooms and there were spaces, but who was living in them? Again, it's a bit unclear. So it's kind of fascinating in one way. It's wonderful. I think the Cretans would really appreciate it. The ancient Cretans would appreciate a revival. Modern Cretans, I'm not sure. They're a little bit Greek Orthodox still, and they make money off of, they may be at first afraid of losing that sort of palace Minoan civilization. My argument would be that actually you'd get an influx of people coming to see it from a different light. I think they'd really love that. So change is slow, you know, change is slow.
Yeah, there's so much interesting stuff in Minoan culture. Like now uncovering all of the amazing kind of drawings and like paintings that they had on all of their walls are so incredible. Like, and like I was talking to one scholar a few months ago who was saying that there seems to be some kind of tree and spirit worship, like spirits coming from these plants.
Yeah.
And she was arguing that the snake mother is actually a priestess and not an object of worship, but
Yeah.
this was actually one of these people, and that they don't actually have gods in the way that the Greeks had gods, that they were kind of these abstract, they're almost depicted as fairies if you've seen the paintings.
Yeah. Yeah, I would believe that.
Interesting to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I think that if we peel back some of the modern bias in interpretation, we may really be surprised at what we find. And I'm all for that. Like, again, of course, we will always have bias, so there's no way to get around it. But if we just try to look at it and try to figure it, like, I'm not opposed to some statues saying this was a priestess rather than a goddess. That's all right. Like, that's still in the matriarchal space, in the matrifocal space, and that's okay. And I'm also not opposed to them saying, well, there were female and male gods they worship. Okay. But I think, like, when we start having a lot of erasure and a lot of like replacement of kings and queens, and there's that room with the chair that Arthur Evan calls a throne room, that we have no evidence it's a throne room at all. Like, it's just a stone chair in the middle of a room. So some of that stuff has to be talked about. Like, why do we keep calling it that? Why do we keep doing this?
Yeah, no, it's another one of these points going back to an earlier thing we talked about, where we just need more perspectives, right? Need more people translating and engaging with this, because when you don't, we all have our own biases, but if someone who doesn't have the same biases as us may see it in a new light that can shine a much more clear, give us a better picture,
Yeah, yeah. And that's not to be feared. I think a lot of those in power do fear that, but it's not to be feared. I don't think so. It's to be, I mean, it's not property, it's learning. Like,
Exactly, right?
right? Like,
We're trying to
Speaking of the
understand.
property, yeah, why do we have to have such this tight grip control on property where it's not going with us when we leave this
that's
place?
true.
So why do we have to have this stronghold? It's insane to me.
Yeah.
Also, I want someone to bring back Minoan fashion, because that would
Yes.
be next level with the cod pieces and the big skirts.
Yes. Yes. I am told that they do some kind of festivals, but I have not seen some kind of plays and festivals in which it's probably a little more conservative, not quite totally full-breasted. But I would love to see it in Crete. I'm told that they do once a year or twice a year, they do something. So I'm going to ask my local friends about that and see if I can film some. That would be amazing.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we'll see where that goes. But that's really exciting work. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
excited for you.
Before we end our talk, we want to hear more about your Artemis Academy. What kind of courses are you offering and have you offered?
So right now I have what I call Goddess Essential courses. So And right now I think I have like 4 or 5 out of 10. And so the reason why I did these, so these are like short online courses that anybody could take. I think they're like $60 and you get 3 hours or 4 hours of lectures and some readings and some stuff. The reason why I did these is because I thought to myself, like, I was invited to a lot of retreats to do lectures, which is really wonderful. I love doing that. One of the things that a lot of people were asking me was like, how do you know? Like, if I wanted to look up a goddess, if I love Inanna, if I love Aphrodite, if I love whatever, how can I find sources that I trust or someone that can tell me about the primary sources? And then from there, build whatever worship I want of her. And I thought, yeah, you're right. Like when I Google Aphrodite or I Google a goddess, you kind of get a very similar storytelling. And I wanted to do something that was not super academic, but academic enough that people thought, well, here's a foundation. I can start from here and then I can, go on with whatever I want to do. And so I'm making these and they're kind of short. You just learn them on your own. You just listen to them on your own. And then I'm going to do a few more workshops through the center, which these I'm kind of going with a vibe because I have at least like 12 or 15 courses in the background on things to do on women in the ancient world. I think it may be a little overambitious. So right now I'm going like 8 weeks. And then the community that we're building is saying, oh, well, we're really going to miss these Saturdays together. I'd like to, do another one coming up. And so it's kind of pushed, it's kind of like motivated by the community, which I really like because it shows me they're really having fun and they're really enjoying it. So I think I'm going to do like some 8-week blocks as far as workshops. And the other thing that I'm doing, but I'm hoping to do this as a fundraiser, I want to do once a month like a live, maybe 1 or 2 hours, where I'm going to talk about like what's new in archaeology and the goddess, right? And I thought that I would be like, like, I don't know, $5 or whatever you want to donate. And I would use that as part of the fundraising. I'm going to try that. I want to start that soon so that, and you could just, sign in and come and so it would be live like this, where we would just be talking and people can ask questions. And I would just be like, so this is what's new. Because there's so much amazing digs that are going on right now. So many great discoveries.
Right.
And so I thought, let's talk about it. Once a month is not a huge commitment, I hope. I do have to put it.
Maybe you could, maybe you could come and do live Q&As. Snappy has a much bigger following than I do. So, doing a Q&A would be awesome to do, there too. And there's a lot of good things happening. Super excited for all your work. I love it.
Thank you guys. Like, anytime, first of all, anytime, it would be wonderful. But also thank you, for helping me get the word out there.
Absolutely. As soon as I read your email, I sent it to Snappy. I was like, Snappy.
I try to watch as much as I can of your goddess project. I'm a couple episodes behind. I watched the most recent one because Buffy recommended it and it was amazing. So
thanks,
I said,
everyone
go
watch Goddess Project. It's a phenomenal YouTube channel that's fun and scholarly. It's not dry, it's entertaining, and you're talking about stuff that people need to know, Like I love, my favorite one you did was on the I think it was the first one I saw was on homosexuality with the Greek gods.
Yeah.
You did a whole week for Pride last year, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
And like no one is doing that kind of stuff.
Really, I thought so. I want to do it again. I want to do it like a yearly thing. I thought everyone was doing it. Like I always thought, is this an original idea? It's not very original. Everyone knows that there was, all this gayness in Greece. And then, so I'm really glad that you said that, Snappy, because I hope that people are enjoying it and watching it. Because I do think like our talk today is very important, that we need to get word out about what was going on in the ancient world.
What I see with a lot of this stuff is like you see people talking about it on TikTok, and there's some good content there, but you also see a lot of jokes, right? It's like, and that's fine, but I want people to talk about what's actually happening, because like, the ancients are no different than we are, and they're just as smart as we are. And if we understand that they had this vibrant culture that had all of this sexual diversity and gender diversity, it can help us reflect upon our own society. And it also, people don't understand these myths, like 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 we were just talking about, like so many people get so bent out of shape, but we have clear homosexual gods. Like Apollo loves Hyacinth. He turns him into a plant, right? After he gets killed, weeps for him, right? You know, Hercules has all those lovers, Achilles, like it's everywhere. Dionysus, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just, and then all of the feminine side, right? Like everyone knows Sappho, but that's one figure, right?
Yeah. It's
Anyway,
true. The one thing that I get all the time, especially from the older generation, is, oh, everybody's gay now, or everybody's trans now, or everybody's whatever. And I'm like, well, actually, as a historian, I can say that it's always been like this, you know? Um, that's one of my favorite comebacks. It's like, let's go back and talk about A, B, and C, you know? So yeah, you're right. It is important that we talk about it because I think some people just genuinely don't know. They just genuinely did not grow up with it, don't know it, never heard of it. And so hopefully those individuals, when they hear it, they go, oh, but you know, you do get a few people that are like, what is your evidence for this? Where did you get this from? Right?
Yeah, and to help those that are feeling the oppression of it,
yeah.
to understand that
That's right.
you have not been born into a world where this is not normal.
Yeah.
Because it is normal.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's one of these things too, for better or for worse, the ancient world still informs our modern world in so many ways. Like these stories are still present in our lives. And these gods and goddesses still have an effect, you
Yes.
know, and they have a huge effect in my life. They've driven my whole life. So this is something I think is important and beautiful. So thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Carla. And with that, we're gonna say adios.
I
Adieu.